Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's interview. Today, I am sitting down with Neal Thompson. He is an author of many different books, including one of the biggest classics, I guess, in the NASCAR library, Driving with the Devil. Neal, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How about you, Brandon? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm doing awesome. Yeah, so I've heard from people for a while now. They were like, if you're gonna read a book, you gotta read Driving with the Devil. And so finally, I got around to it, and I was like, all right, let me go ahead and tackle this. And man, I've really been enjoying reading it. So that's why I felt like I needed to reach out. So I was like, all right, I need to kind of see the behind the scenes of this, as well as I'm sure a lot of the listeners have either heard of the book or read the book. So now they can kind of put a face to the person who wrote the book. So I was really excited about this interview.
That's cool. I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the word classic.
Mhm.
Uh, I think it's funny that the book has been out for a long time now. And like you and I were just talking before we started, it's great to hear from readers and other NASCAR fans who come to me by email or whatever and say, "Hey, I read your book. It really meant a lot to me." And I
Mhm.
learned stuff about my sport that I hadn't even known before. And
Yeah.
for a book that came out in 2004 to still be connecting with readers is just it's every writer's dream. It's cool. And for me, I think it's kind of fun too because guy from New Jersey who grew up in the North, full on Yankee. Spent a lot of time in the South, which is what kind of triggered some of my interest. But I think that kind of outsider's perspective
Mhm.
maybe helped. Just I came in as sort of this observer to the sport and the history of it, and maybe had a different perspective or a different way of looking at things and
Yeah.
and how it all came about.
Yeah, it's awesome. I tell people all the time that if I'm going to a NASCAR race, I love taking someone who's never been there because the questions they ask, it makes me start looking at stuff versus if I go to someone who's been in the sport forever, me as they show up, they're just like, well, I want to see cars go fast and I don't want to see Kyle Busch win or whatever,
Right.
whereas when it's someone new to the sport, they're like, wait, so
Right.
how are the tires? How does the race go? How does this work? And it's cool because it kind of makes me fall in love with the sport again because you have that perspective of they don't think it was just a stupid question because there's questions they ask and I think that's just how it is. But I'm like, why is it like that?
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah. Why did it come about that way? Yeah.
mhm,
I mean, you name it, down to the style and shape of the cards, and what's
mhm,
the backstory to that? How did that all come about? What. And I guess some of that's what triggered my interest when I started researching this, going way back. It's probably
mhm.
been 20 years since I started digging into the history. It was, call it 2000, 2001, 2002, something like that. You might not have even been born yet, Brandon. Um, but you know, NASCAR was blowing up at the time.
Mhm.
It was big, but it was just I felt like I was seeing it everywhere.
Yeah.
It had this sort of moment back in the early 2000s, and I wanted to know like what's happening here. Where did it all start? What's the backstory to this
Mhm.
sport? Every other sport has some sort of lore to it and an origin story. And I mentioned growing up in in New Jersey, but my dad was a race fan, more sports cars and Formula One stuff, and occasional stock car races. But he would take me to races in Pocono and was it Glen Rock? I was just a little
Mhm.
kid, but so I'd been to a few races as a kid. My dad was a tinkerer; he worked on cars, so I had kind of an interest in sports and racing to a certain extent, but I really didn't know anything really
Yeah.
about the backstory of NASCAR. Um, and when I first started looking into it, I came across the kind of typical accepted story. Bill France,
Mhm.
the quote founder of NASCAR, right?
Yeah.
Like, he gets all this credit, as does his family, and in certain ways, some of that's justified. But it just felt like too clean of a
Mhm.
story. I wanted to know, especially a sport like NASCAR, come on,
Yeah.
where did this really all start? Who were the guys who were involved before Bill France started making money off this thing? And that's what led me to guys like Raymond
Mhm.
Parks and Lloyd C. and Roy Hall and Red Vogt and Red Byron. That's really what the story is about. It's like this. It's a backstory to how NASCAR came about in the first place.
Yeah.
1930s, 1940s, the real gritty era of the sport.
So I guess taking a step back, how did you first get into writing? Because it kind of seems like you were more of a writer before you really immersed yourself into the sport, or I guess wanted to learn more about it. So kind of how did that come about? Like when did you decide, oh, I want to get into writing?
Yeah, yeah. I guess one of these kids who always knew who wanted to be a writer of some kind. In high
Mhm.
school, I had one teacher, Mrs. Fitzgibbons, who said, "Hey, you're pretty good at this. Why don't you try harder at writing? Maybe you'd be a writer someday." One of those teacher things that just stuck in my head, even though I was a terrible student otherwise. And I thought I'd be a novelist. I started writing short stories in high school and college, and they were all just terrible. Got nothing published, but then decided, all right, I'm not going to become a novelist the day I graduate college. Let's figure something out where I can actually write for a living. And that's how I got into newspapers. So I was a newspaper reporter for almost 15 years, up and down the East Coast, mainly like Baltimore and Southwest Virginia. I worked at a paper in Roanoke, Virginia, which is probably my first exposure to NASCAR country.
Mhm.
And I did that for a bunch of years, and it was fun. And then I started writing longer stories for magazines. And then I decided I wanted to write a book, and that's what led me to my first book, which was a biography of Alan Shepard, the astronaut, first
Mhm.
American in space. That book was called Light This Candle, and it was a kind of a revelation where I could tell, a true story, a historical story, uh, but ideally do it in a way that just felt fun, not like a history
Yeah.
book, but like a page turner, like a novel. And that's what I tried to do with Driving with the Devil too,
Mhm.
is just make it a fun read, make it exciting. And So yeah, after writing my first book, Like This Candle, even before that was done, I had latched on to the NASCAR idea and already started researching it and making some trips to the South to do
Mhm.
some interviews. And then my wife and I decided, it was actually right after 9/11, um, that I took a leave of absence from my newspaper, which is the Baltimore Sun, and the year-long gap from that job was coming up, and we decided, let's move. I'm starting on this NASCAR project, and
Mhm.
my wife had family in North Carolina, just south of Asheville, North Carolina. So we up and pulled up roots and moved south without jobs and without anything, and just figured it out. And it was great. We loved Asheville. We loved living down there, and it brought me closer to all the research that I needed for the book.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and so one of the things I first did, I started reaching out to old timers. There weren't too many left, but
Mhm.
pretty much anybody I talked to, including guys like Junior Johnson, would say, who you really need to talk to? You should go talk to Raymond Parks.
Yeah.
And that's really when the book started, and it wouldn't be the book it is without his help, which took a while.
Yeah, I know from my own personal experience, it is amazing how I don't know if it's just people are used to people getting stories and twisting it or whatever, but there's kind of this, if when someone comes along and they say, I'm working on a project, I've learned there's kind of a wariness, but once you sit down with them, then it's super easy for them to say, oh, reach out to this person. And it's been so cool because I sit down and I'm like, the first, time you sit down, it's so difficult, but like you said, it gets rolling. And then that next thing you know, you're talking to this guy and that guy, and they're just going on and on with this story and that story. And you're like, man, how do I jot down all this info?
Right. That's where the tape recorder comes in handy.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'm fascinated by that, and I always have been as a journalist and a writer. And I think
Mhm.
people want to tell their stories. They love to talk,
Yeah.
not about themselves necessarily, although there's plenty of that. But people want to talk about what they know and what they're passionate about, right?
Mhm.
And I think it comes down to how you approach them. Like, there's the obnoxious way to do it, like sticking a
Yeah.
microphone in somebody's face and, tell me your story. Or you really get to know them and you're patient, and you take your time, and then they come to trust you, and then they really open up
Mhm.
with you. And I'd say that's what happened with Raymond Parks. He, was super wary when I first went to see him. I
Yeah.
called him up. He was, at the time, he was still working at one of his last liquor shops that he owned in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Called him up, said, "Hey, I'm working on this book." And he's like, "No, I don't want to talk about that. That's all in the past." I'd say, all right, I appreciate that. I respect that. Do you mind if I just come by sometime when I'm in Atlanta and just say hello and introduce myself? That'd be fine. That'd be fine. So, I just started showing up at his liquor store and saying hi, telling him how my research was going, and I'd, tell him who I had talked to. And I think he little by little, he learned that I was serious about this and I wasn't going to go away. But it literally took Asheville to Atlanta, it's not a short drive. Mm-hmm. So I would make that drive, a handful of times before the first time he really opened up. He didn't even really start talking to me or like doing a formal interview. He said, "Well, let me show you some pictures." And he brought out these old, photo albums, which were mind blowing. Like it was a turning point for me and for the book, because he had pictures of everything, and some of them are in the book. Yeah. He's got a picture of the corpse of his cousin Lloyd C. after he's gotten killed in a moonshining argument with his other cousin. Like, he's got a picture of the sheriff holding the murder weapon. He's got pictures of all these races from the 30s and 40s. And so he brings these photo albums out and just starts leafing through them. And I asked him to tell me a little bit about that race and that picture. And he just started opening up. And it just cracked things wide open for my book, because Raymond knew everything and everybody. And I didn't realize until he started talking that he was really at the forefront of the whole sport. He was, truly one of the founding fathers. And I think he's recognized as that now. But it took a while, because he wasn't one to talk about his own story. Bill France had taken the sport and run with it and legitimized it and made money off of it and made it a family enterprise. And I think Raymond had his issues with that, but he wasn't gonna, go out there and say, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm actually one of the guys." But I think in time he appreciated that I came to him and said, and really took my time with it, but said, "I want to know your story. Tell me how you got into this. Tell me." So he was key to the whole project, and just a nice guy, I thankfully got to him and got to spend time with him before he started to have some health issues, and I forget when he died, but it's been a number of years. But we became buddies. He was a good dude.
Yeah, I think too, you like when I first started this interview series, it kind of was birthed from this idea of, I saw so many people that had other interviews or they did NASCAR videos, but just every video was either talking about how, man, this guy was such a bad race car driver, let's laugh at him. Or they would say, here's what's wrong with the sport. And I was just thinking, I don't feel like you're enjoying it at all, because it's just all this negativity. And one thing I think I enjoyed about the book is that I tell my friends all the time that you can tell stories and you can report them and you can be honest without having to be pessimistic. And that's one thing with your book is, I feel like it's a very honest look at what happened, but none of it comes across as an attack on someone. Or, I don't read this book and think, oh, I don't want to watch NASCAR. It makes me more of like, some stuff gets twisted with history. And, that's one thing I really appreciate about the book, is that it has that honesty without being pessimistic or without kind of questioning, why do I even like this sport? All these people, were bad, or, whatever. So, moving on, did you have any stories that stood out as your favorite from the book?
There were so many. I just really appreciated the I think of them as characters in a sense, because the only one I really got to know in person was Raymond, but they're just so original and so real and so raw and so passionate. Like, probably my favorite, just because his story is so crazy to me, is Red Byron. And when I started researching the book, I was shocked to even hear the name and then learn, he was NASCAR's first champion. Like, why isn't he plastered everywhere on their,
Yeah.
historical information or the Hall of Fame. And I think now he is appreciated and held up as one of the pioneers of the sport. But when I first started looking into it, people were like, "Wait, I don't know that dude. Who's that?"
Hmm.
He was awesome. I mean, he wasn't from the South, but he grew up in sort of circumstances that I'd say were like similar to, Raymond Parks and
Hmm.
Lloyd C. and Roy Hall and those guys. Came from a rough background, poor family, and found something in racing and in stock cars in particular that just gave him some freedom. I tried to explore that in the book. Like, what was it about
Yeah.
these early guys? Because those are not easy cars to drive. They were not easy races to race. It was messy and dirty and grimy and dangerous, like super
Hmm.
dangerous. It always has been, but back then, you didn't have the safety features you got now, of course. So I wanted to know more about this guy who kind of came out of nowhere, moved himself to the South, to Talladega area, because he wanted to be near the better racetracks. And sort of little by little starts insinuating himself into the sport and having some success.
Hmm.
Then World War II happens and he goes off. And he's I forget what his exact job was. He was sort of an engineer or technician in bomber planes. And then he nearly gets his leg shot off. Comes back after World War II with this really bad injury to his left leg. At one point, the doctors wanted to amputate, and he said, "No way! Like, I'm a race car driver. I need that
Hmm.
leg. Just fix it as best you can." So he had a really nasty injury. He kind of rehabbed it as best he could, but he wasn't perfect. He walked with a limp, and I get into this in the book. He had to have a brace on his leg. And then Red Vogt, the mechanic who worked for the team that Raymond Parks started in the actually before World War II, and then restarted it after World War II.
Hmm.
Red Vogt, the genius mechanic, had to put pins on the clutch pedal so that Red Byron could put his injured leg sort of up onto the pedal, and the boot would be
Hmm.
positioned into these pins, and then he would have to just kind of shift his body to change gears. I mean, that's just wild to think of that, for anybody to do that, but then to go on to win as many races as he did in the mid
Hmm.
and late 1940s, and then to win, NASCAR's first stock championship is just incredible. And then he just, into the 50s, he kind of faded. 1950s, he kind of faded away into oblivion,
Hmm.
got overlooked. So I think he's one of my favorite characters or people in the book.
Hmm.
But they're all fantastic. It's fun.
Yeah. You spoke a little bit as on it earlier, but many people claim that this is one of the must reads when it comes to being a NASCAR fan. If you want just a really in-depth look, and not it's not in a negative way, because it is difficult to sit there and tell someone 50 years worth of history in 2 minutes. But a lot of times it's more of like, here's Bill France, here's this guy holding a trophy. But this is a really in-depth look, a real honest look. As a writer, what does it mean to you to have a book that's made such an impact? And like you said, 17 years later, you still have people like myself that are picking it up thinking, man, this is a cool dive. I'm learning stuff. I'm 29 years old. I consider myself a real big fan of NASCAR, but there's stuff in here that I'm like, I didn't even know that happened.
That's awesome. I mean, that's just so great to hear. It's so gratifying so many years later that it's still reaching readers and having an impact and teaching people
Mhm.
about the sport that they love. I mean, there's nothing better. I've had other books that just came and went like instantly, and so to have it kind of alive and sort of part of a conversation now and then, sort of the broader conversation about the sport and where it came from. And I love it. It's why I think I spent years researching it and really tried to go as deep as I could, because there was
Mhm.
just so much great background there. And I think too, what I liked about the story, and hopefully this relates to what you're talking about, is I think there's a lot about the origins of the sport that still are like relevant to today's NASCAR.
Yeah.
You know, it's obviously not a sport of moonshiners, and it's not as, you know, gritty as it once was, but there still is this rebel spirit to the sport. I
Yeah.
think that's what a lot of fans love, and I also think it's what a lot of fans feel like is missing or isn't as prominent in the sport as it was. You know, Dale Earnhardt's are gone. It's become really, you know, a sport of money and big sponsorship. So I think knowing where some of the more rebellious attitudes of the sport came from, and seeing glimpses of them today, you can sort of draw a line from, you know, Raymond Parks to some of today's drivers, and understand where some of that came from and why.
It's finally, you know, there's been so many great moments. Like you said, there's so many great characters in the history of NASCAR. If you were to be given a time machine, you know, is there a story, either, you know, from your book or even, you know, more present or whatever, is there a story or a moment or a person that you'd love to jump in that time machine and go back and either, you know, sit down with the person or experience that moment, you know, as it happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many. You know, I mentioned Red Byron. There were a couple particular races that I think are interesting and kind of tragic, but fascinating to me. You know, I think it was the 1948 season. I'm going off old memory, but I think that was it. And during that season, Red Byron was, you know, pretty high in the rankings through that year. Fonty Flock, one of the famous Flock brothers, was up there too, and they were sort of going back and forth in the points in the standings. And there was one race, and I think it was Columbus, Georgia, maybe midway through the season, and it might have been actually the last lap of that race, and Red Byron was in the lead and blew a tire in a turn, and just drove into the crowd. Like, there's nothing he could do. And I have a picture of it as it happened. And I was looking at it before we talked. It's amazing. You know, it's a chicken wire fence, right? And a couple of posts. There are no guardrails. There's no safety features, nothing. And so he blows a tire and he goes plowing into the crowd. And there are a bunch of injuries. One guy lost his leg. And then this little boy, I forget his name, it's in the book, but he got hit in the head with a post and died. So Red Byron was like devastated by that. And I'm not saying I would want to see that race. The race I would be interested in seeing is the final race of that season, back at the same racetrack, Columbus, Georgia, where and again, I'm going off memory, but I think I know Red Byron won it, but I think it was a back and forth battle between him and I believe Fonty Flock, and then Red Byron finally won the race, and I think he needed to win that race to stay ahead in the points standing, and that's how he won that championship. So I think it's fascinating for him to have won on a track where he experienced this tragic event previously in the season, and he has to come back and sort of block it out of his mind. So I mean, it's stories like that. There's one after another in the book, and I'm fascinated by that. And I'll add one other thing. I also think I would love to have been at the old beach track at Daytona. You know, with especially the north turn, and I have some pictures of that in the book. Again, people just standing right next to the track, oblivious, but to see those old cars come through that north turn in the sand, and sometimes getting up on two wheels and plowing their way through, I think that would have been pretty cool.
It's awesome. Well, Neal, thanks again for joining us and getting to share some stories about this book and all. I highly recommend it to anyone listening to this. You know, it's a great look into the history and the origins of NASCAR.
Thanks, man. Great to talk to you. Thanks for your interest in the book, and I hope people will pick it up.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.